All right. Hello and welcome to the ninth video in the Logic and Critical Thinking series. Um, this one's about thinking about arguments. And I'm Kalman Andrassi, and we're going to be talking about applying the things that we've learned in previous video lectures to argumentation. Okay. So we have to begin by recognizing what an argument ultimately is. An argument is a form of thinking in which reasons are offered in support of some sort of a conclusion, right? So you're ultimately applying logic, you're applying positivistic, evidence based reasoning and rationale behind why you come to a particular type of conclusion. Okay, so reasons can support a conclusion, it can justify a conclusion, or it can make a conclusion more probable than other potential alternative conclusions. And meanwhile, a conclusion explains or asserts or predicts some sort of an outcome based on reasons that have been offered as evidence. So it's sort of that two-way street. Okay. And of course, you sometimes see certain keywords or cue words that signal that a reason or a conclusion is being offered in the case of an argumentation in favor of or against a particular topic. Okay. So in constructing arguments, we ultimately are relating to the world through something called inference, or the conclusions that are reached that are based on our evidence and reasoning to kind of back them up, right? So inference or inferential reasoning is all about coming to the conclusions that we are led to on the basis of evidence or reasoning. Okay. So arguments are generally made for a number of different purposes. We can use them to help us to decide a particular course of action. So it's a decision-making function that it serves. We can use it to explain some sort of a phenomenon. Explanatory power might be attached to an argument. We sometimes use it to make predictions, right? We establish some sort of a criterion by which we expect a certain outcome, and then we see if our logic and reasoning can inform what is likely to occur in a certain set of circumstances. And arguments are used to try to be persuasive or to persuade somebody to adopt a particular viewpoint. Okay. And we can evaluate the effectiveness or the soundness of arguments that have already been constructed by examining the truth or the veracity behind any claims that are being made, and then the validity of the arguments. Basically, does the evidence tend to suggest what the conclusion is ultimately asserting? Okay. So the next step is to essentially try to determine the rationale and the truth behind any type of an argument, right? So we evaluate the truth of the reasons used to support a conclusion. Okay. How do we do that? Well, first we determine, does each reason make sense, right? Does it follow logically that the evidence, whatever the rationale is, would lead to the end conclusion that is being made? What evidence is being offered as part of each reason, right? Is there some sort of an objective element to the rationale? And in turn, does that evidence tend to suggest the things that happen in the supposed conclusion? Okay. Do you know each reason to be true based on your own experience, right? Sometimes we think about things on their face. Is whatever it is that you're examining something that would be consistent with what you would expect to happen, again, based on your previous experiences and things that have happened in the past? And is each reason based on a source that can be trusted? And that's something that can be somewhat difficult in the modern times that we're living in today. You know, fake news abound, individual writing up persuasive articles on the internet, for example, that have no basis in reality. They're simply there to advocate for a particular viewpoint without necessarily being backed by any objective rationale or evidence. Okay. And then we get to the notion of validity. And generally, when we think of validity, it's all about, if you have some sort of an instrument that is measuring some sort of a phenomenon, is it actually measuring what it purports to measure, right? So in this case, does the reasoning support the conclusion? Does the reasoning actually lend itself to the conclusions that you're trying to make, essentially, right? And with that, we are going to explore two concepts. One is deductive reasoning, and that is when the reasons that support some sort of a conclusion are actually made in such a way that the conclusion actually follows from the reasons. In other words, the reasons line the path that leads one to come to the conclusion that is made. And if that is what is being done, then that argument is considered valid. Now, kind of on the flip side, the opposite of deductive reasoning is something called inductive reasoning. And that is when you're actively seeking out pieces of evidence in order to try to build a general explanation. And essentially, you're developing what the conclusion ought to be on the basis of the evidence, kind of in reverse. With deductive reasoning, you're usually starting with a central premise, and you are testing to see if the reasoning leads to that final premise. Whereas in inductive reasoning, you're trying to build the premise in the first place. Okay. Then, of course, a big issue and something that you could learn pretty extensively about are a number of fallacies that may exist in the argument for a particular type of conclusion. So if reasons do not support the conclusion the way that you essentially expect them to, such that the conclusion does not follow from the reasons, then the argument is deemed to be invalid. Okay, and go ahead and Google yourself a list of common fallacies, which are, they probably find several dozen that, again, kind of showcase and illustrate situations in which your conclusion is not arrived at on the basis of the reasoning, the rationale, and the evidence that is presented. Okay, so a little bit more on deductive reasoning, right? Deductive reasoning is the application of a general rule known as the Socratic syllogism, which is used whenever we try to apply a general rule in the form of, in this case, all A is B. So again, following the conventions of logic, we have a lot of different logic statements that have to be shown to be true in order to come to certain types of conclusions. An example of that is that all A is B, right? So all dogs are animals, for example, right? That would be a general rule that is applicable across the board for all of the dogs. All dogs are going to be animals. And then, of course, you might find the rationale behind what makes an animal, and then what makes a dog, and there should be overlap in the reasoning that goes into that. Okay, we have the concept of modus ponens, right? That is also known as affirming the antecedent, right? That's the idea that the conclusion will be true if the reasons are true. In other words, if the things that have led you to come to the conclusion are true, then your conclusion is ultimately going to be true. We also have modus tollens, which is denying the consequence. So all conclusions are accurate if the reasons are true, right? We're applying Socratic rationale to these things and understanding the logic behind how we get to how do we deduce a conclusion based on the evidence. And the last element here of the Socratic syllogism that's applied is disjunctive syllogism. So if the premises are accurate, then the conclusion must be true, right? So if the basis for some sort of a conclusion is grounded in reality, then we can come to the agreement that the conclusion that stems from it is also going to be true. Okay? And that is basically what makes up arguments and how you can determine the truth and how you can determine whether or not the rationale behind an argument is actually true or leads to some inappropriate conclusions about the way the world operates. Okay? Now, that all being said, you have different types of arguments. You can have arguments that stem from just, one-on-one interaction, vocally. But it's also important to note the importance of writing down the arguments and the conclusions that you come to, right? In the scientific method, a big component of the process is the communication of ideas, right? And if you're simply arguing with somebody vocally, those arguments can be lost in time if they're not recorded in one way or another, right? So generally speaking, in academia, as is the kind of the focus of this particular lecture series, the intention is for individuals that are taking a university course in logic and critical thinking. The idea there is that you have to write down, create some sort of a report on any type of argumentation that you are using to justify decision making or come to conclusions, because if you're not sharing that information, it is basically of no use to anybody. So be sure to master the conventions of writing in whatever language you're going to be writing. So if you're in the United States, it's probably going to be following the conventions of the English language. And it would always be a beneficial thing to potentially take a class about written reasoning as well, English language reasoning, in the case of most of my students, to be able to, again, not only advocate for certain perspectives and make arguments, but to have them recorded in some way, such as might be the case in a research report where you are making arguments about the nature of the reality of some sort of social or other phenomena, and you have to kind of justify that. And if you put that in writing, then other people can see the arguments that you've made. They could potentially replicate whatever it is that you were examining or researching or what have you, and hopefully they would come to the same conclusions as you would in exercising their logic and reasoning in coming to understand your perspectives for the argument and the conclusions that you've made. All right. And with that, that is going to be it for this particular video. I hope to see you in future videos as well. Have a fantastic day.